Now, people in England and Wales who own their own home, leasehold, effectively buy just the right to live there for many years. They never actually own the property. They do have some rights to buy that ownership, called the freehold, but in a final consultation report out this week, the Independent Law Commission says the law is complex, slow and expensive. The Law Commission was asked by the government to look at the rights of leaseholders following a lot of recent controversy. Money Box reporter Dan Whitworth here. Dan, leasehold problems have been in the news and indeed on Moneybox quite a lot recently.
Yes, they have, with people who own leasehold properties describing the system as inherently unfair. And I'll explain why, Paul. A lease will usually start at either 99 or 125 years and slowly run down over time. Now, for a residential property, a lease of under 70 years, say, will mean you may struggle to get a mortgage.
And are leaseholders under certain obligations as well?
Very much so. Things like maintenance fees, annual service charges and a share of the building's insurance. There can also be restrictions on carrying out, say, building works or even minor changes without permission. Crucially, there can be ground rent too. Now, that's paid by the leaseholder to the freeholder. And in recent years, this particular aspect has become extremely contentious, with some terms being set, meaning the ground rent you pay, which can initially look affordable, doubles every 10 years.
So what specifically are the Law Commission's reforms addressing?
Right, well, their recommendations only look at the issue of extending the lease or acquiring the freehold of a property. Now, that's also known as enfranchisement. The cost of this is worked out by a formula, including the number of years left on your lease, and secondly, what your ground rent is. Now, the resulting amount is referred to as the marriage value. Now, that process can be both complicated and expensive. Here's Professor Nicholas Hope from the Law Commission speaking to us earlier this year.
What we've been asked to do by government is provide options that will reduce the price but provide sufficient payment to the landlord. So what we set out are a range of options. They fall broadly into two categories. So one is to wipe the slate clean from the current law and provide a simple formula. The other would be to use the current formula, but, for example, to fix all of the rates that are used within it, or take marriage value out of the equation completely.
So, Dan, some vocal campaigners are against the idea of leasehold altogether, aren't they? What have they had to say about this?
Yes, they are. Well, I asked Jo Darbyshire, she's one of them. She's the co-founder of the National Leasehold Campaign, and I asked her what she thought of the Law Commission's proposals.
The enfranchisement proposals themselves, the Law Commission's done a very thorough job and done as much as they can within the very, very tight terms of reference they were given by the government. And that's the problem, really, because they've been asked to ensure that freeholders get sufficient compensation. But there's nothing in there for compensation for leaseholders who've been systematically missold leasehold properties for the last few years.
And in fact, on those tight terms of reference, the Department for Communities and Local Government, who are responsible, told us that, quote, the government is committed to tackling unfair practices in the leasehold sector and that they encourage people to feed back their views to the consultation.
Thanks, Dan. Well, that's England and Wales, but in Scotland things are very different. Leasehold was abolished there in 2004. Live now to Glasgow to talk to Alan Cook. He's a partner at lawyers Pinsent Masons and he specialises in property law. Alan Cook, the Scottish Government just abolished leasehold. Was it that simple? How did it do it?
There was quite a process involved. Scottish property law is very different from English law, which means that we then tend not to use leases for ownership of flats, as is the case in England and Wales. Scottish law was modernised in its land ownership system a few years ago, and as part of that process, a decision was made that the historic controls that were in that system were not to be replicated within lease structures. So in 1974, the lease length for residential leases was restricted to a maximum of 20 years. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, because there were some historic very long leases of houses, those were converted into outright ownership.
So they did do it. Could it happen in England and Wales? I mean, we've been told the Law Commission's report wasn't as radical as it might be. Could it have been more radical and said, well, let's scrap it in England and Wales?
I think the government's got some proposals to scrap it for for houses. When it comes to flats, it is more complex because of the technicalities of English property law.
But of course, I'm told that there's only 7 countries in the world now that have leaseholds. So people who are stuck in these things get a bit sort of annoyed about it. And also, as Joe Darbyshire said, it's the freeholders who they think are sort of holding them over a barrel in some cases get the benefits. They are actually paid to get rid of the leases.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if a decision was made to be particularly imaginative and think out the box on the whole thing, then the law can be changed to say anything that you want. Ultimately, the difficulty, of course, with the position of the freeholders is that the leases do entitle them to rents and things like that, and those entitlements can't simply be scrapped.
No, I mean, they have rights under human rights, don't they, for possession of property, as I understand it. So you can't just get rid of them. You've got to pay them something.
That's right. And there was compensation paid to the owners of the long lease interests in Scotland when those were converted.
The Law Commission was set a very narrow remit, just to look at enfranchisement, this conversion of leasehold into freehold. Is it a bit of a waste of time? Is it not radical enough in your view?
Well, it depends what appetite there is on the part of government to introduce more radical changes. It's true, English law has got itself into a very complex situation in terms of how leasehold arrangements work. And I think there's 2 ways you can go. You can do more tinkering, or you can go for a complete root and branch change, which would be really quite fundamental.
Yes, so we'll have to see what happens. Alan Cook, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.